The night I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a mug of decaf I hadn't touched. It had gone cold. I just stood there. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there in my socks on the linoleum floor my late mother had picked out in 1987, thinking, this is how it ends, 31 years. Cold coffee and linoleum. Let me back up. My name is Howard. I'm 64 years old. I worked 30 years as a structural engineer for the county, retired with a decent pension, and I genuinely thought that the hardest part of my life was behind me. Bad knees, a hearing aid in my left ear, the occasional argument about the thermostat. That was supposed to be my biggest problem. My wife's name is Patrice. She came into my life when I was 32 and she was 28, and she was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors. She volunteered at the library on Tuesdays. For 31 years, I thought I knew exactly who she was. And my son-in-law, my daughter Elaine's husband, his name is Kevin. Kevin had been in our lives for 4 years. They met at a work conference in Atlanta. They did long distance for a year. Got married in our backyard on a Saturday in October. I walked Elaine down the aisle between the rose bushes I'd planted myself. I shook Kevin's hand at the altar and looked him in the eye, and I thought, okay, this one's solid. Kevin was 37. He worked in commercial real estate. He had very straight teeth and a firm handshake, and he talked about investment portfolios the way other men talk about football. Always had a number in his head. Always had an angle. I didn't see it then. I do now. The first time I noticed something was off, I dismissed it. It was a Sunday morning, maybe 8 months before everything fell apart. I came downstairs earlier than usual. My knee was acting up and I couldn't sleep. And I saw Patrice standing in the driveway in her robe, talking to Kevin. Just talking. Nothing unusual about that on its face. But she touched his arm. It was a small thing. The kind of touch that lasts less than a second. But something about it sat wrong with me all day. Like a splinter I couldn't see but could feel. I didn't say anything. I poured my coffee and I told myself I was being ridiculous. Patrice was 61 years old. Kevin was our daughter's husband. Some thoughts don't deserve a voice. So I kept quiet. Over the next few months I noticed other things. Little things. Kevin started coming over more often, always with a reason. Helping with the gutters, dropping off something Elaine forgot, just passing by. He and Patrice would end up in the kitchen together while I was in the garage or out back, and by the time I'd come in, the conversation would shift. Not stop, just shift. Lighten, like changing channels. He started texting her. I saw the notifications, not the messages, just her name lighting up his screen when he set his phone down at dinner. I told myself, families are complicated. I told myself I was 64 years old and getting paranoid in my retirement and I should take up a hobby. I bought a book about woodworking. I never opened it. The thing that finally made it undeniable happened on a Wednesday in March. I had a routine cardiology follow-up downtown. Nothing serious, just monitoring a mild arrhythmia my doctor caught 2 years ago. The appointment ran short. The doctor was ahead of schedule. We were done in 20 minutes, and I drove home thinking I'd make lunch and watch the afternoon game. I pulled into the driveway and saw Kevin's car, a gray Audi. Parked halfway up the driveway like he owned the place. I sat in my truck for a moment. Then I went in through the garage. I won't describe what I saw in detail. I'll just say that I stood in the doorway of my own living room in the house I had paid for and maintained and loved for 26 years, and I saw my wife with my daughter's husband, and the world went very, very quiet. I don't know how long I stood there. Probably 3 seconds. Felt like 3 years. I backed out of the doorway before either of them saw me. I went back through the garage. I got in my truck. I drove to a Cracker Barrel 2 miles down the highway, and I sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes staring at the steering wheel. I want to be honest about what I felt in that parking lot, because I think it matters. I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated. There's a difference, and most people don't talk about the humiliation part. The hurt you can cry about. The humiliation just sits in your chest like a stone you can't move and can't put down. 31 years. And I was the last to know. That was the thought that kept coming back. Not what I'd seen. Not even the betrayal of it, but the sheer arithmetic of how long it must have been going on, and how thoroughly I had been fooled, and how many Sunday mornings I'd probably made breakfast while they were texting each other 3 feet away. I was the last to know. I drove home after the Cracker Barrel. Patrice was in the kitchen making dinner like nothing had happened. Kevin's car was gone. She asked how my appointment went, and I said fine. And I sat down at the table and I ate the chicken she made, and I did not say one word about what I had seen. That night, I lay awake in the dark, and I made a decision. I was not going to blow this up. Not yet. Not until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Because here's the thing people don't consider when they're standing in the wreckage of a betrayal. The moment you confront, you lose control. The other person gets to react, to explain, to spin, to cry. You become the one managing their emotions instead of your own. And if there are legal and financial considerations, which, after 31 years of marriage and a house and a pension and joint accounts, there absolutely were, blowing up before you're ready is the worst thing you can do. I knew this because I had watched my older brother go through a divorce 20 years ago. He found out, he yelled, she lawyered up before he'd finished his sentence, and he spent 4 years in court and came out the other side with half of what he should have had. I was not going to make that mistake, so I did something that felt deeply unnatural to me. I called my daughter, not to tell her. I want to be clear about that. Calling Elaine and saying, I saw your husband with your mother, was not something I was capable of doing over the phone in a Cracker Barrel parking lot. That conversation would have to happen in person, with time, with care. She deserved that. I called her because I needed to hear her voice, and because some part of me needed to know if she already knew. She answered on the second ring. She sounded normal. Tired. She'd had a long week at work, but normal. We talked for 15 minutes about nothing. Her dog had a vet appointment. She was thinking about planting tomatoes this year. Before I hung up, I said, almost without meaning to, "You doing okay, sweetheart? I mean really okay." There was a pause. Just a half-second pause. But I'd spent 30 years reading structural blueprints, finding the crack in the beam that everyone else missed. I was good at noticing the thing that didn't fit. She said, "I'm fine, Dad. Why?" I said, "I don't know. Just checking." We hung up. I lay awake that whole night thinking about that pause. The next morning, I called the family law attorney, his name. I found through my former colleague's recommendation, a man named Patterson who had handled divorces in our county for 30 years. I told him I needed a consultation, that I wasn't certain yet what I was dealing with, and that I needed to understand my options before I took any steps. He was patient. He was thorough. He walked me through what a 31-year marriage looked like in our state, equitable distribution, pension considerations, the house, the retirement accounts. He told me to document everything I could, carefully, without tipping my hand. I drove home and I started paying attention in a different way. I'm not proud of some of what I did in the following 3 weeks. I'm not going to pretend it felt clean or righteous. I set up a camera in the living room, one of those small ones that looks like an air freshener, after watching 3 YouTube tutorials on my phone in the driveway so Patrice wouldn't see. I went through phone records I was legally entitled to see because it was a joint account. I noted dates and times and patterns. What I found confirmed what I already knew. And it also told me something worse. Kevin had been encouraging Patrice in writing, in text messages I was able to access, to think about what the house was worth, what my pension paid out, what she'd be entitled to in a divorce. He'd been feeding her numbers, coaching her. He wasn't just having an affair with my wife, he was helping her plan around me. The stone in my chest got heavier. But something else happened too. The humiliation started to harden into something more useful. I stopped feeling like a man standing in a doorway, stunned. I started feeling like a man with a blueprint in his hand. I called Elaine on a Thursday evening and I asked if I could come over the next morning. Just me. I said I had something I needed to talk to her about in person. She said yes. I drove to her house the next morning with a folder. The conversation I had with my daughter that Friday morning is one I will carry for the rest of my life. She opened the door and she looked at my face, and before I even sat down, she said, "Dad, I know something's wrong. Just tell me." So I told her. I showed her the documentation I had, the texts, the dates, the financial conversations Kevin had been having with her mother. She sat across from me at her kitchen table and she didn't cry. Not right away. She read everything very carefully. The way her mother used to read menus, slowly, completely, making sure she didn't miss anything. And then she said something that broke open the last few weeks for me in a single sentence. She said, "Dad, I've been suspicious for almost a year." She had noticed the same things I noticed. The shifted conversations, the arm touch, the texts. She had confronted Kevin twice, not about my wife specifically, but about a feeling she couldn't name. He had denied it both times with such conviction that she'd started to question her own instincts. She had been quietly, privately falling apart for months. And here I had been, 30 minutes away, going through the same thing alone. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. I didn't try to manage her grief. I didn't try to fix it. I just let her feel it, and I sat there with her, and eventually she got up and poured us both coffee, and she sat back down and she said, "Okay, what do we do?" That was my daughter. 61 years of raising and watching and hoping and praying, and she gave me that sentence right when I needed it most. What do we do? We made a plan. Elaine had always been organized. She got that from me. She worked in hospital administration. She dealt with logistics and documentation every day of her professional life. Within a week, she had quietly consulted her own attorney, a woman who specialized in family law and had a particular expertise in situations involving marital assets and third-party interference. Here's what we determined together. Kevin's conversations with Patrice about my finances, coaching her on what she'd be entitled to, what the house was worth, how the pension would split, potentially crossed into legally actionable territory depending on how a court chose to read it. Our attorneys communicated. We were careful and methodical. Meanwhile, I had a conversation with my financial advisor, a man I'd worked with for 15 years named Gaines, about restructuring some accounts that were within my rights to restructure. I wasn't hiding anything. I was simply organizing what was legally mine to organize before any proceedings began. Patrice noticed none of it. She was, if anything, more attentive to me during this period. She made my favorite meals. She asked about my knee. She watched television with me in the evenings like it was any other year of our lives. I have thought about that a great deal since. Whether she felt guilty or whether she had simply made a clean internal separation between what she was doing and how she was living, I still don't know. I'm not sure I want to. The confrontation, when it came, was nothing like what I had imagined in that Cracker Barrel parking lot. It was a Saturday in May. Elaine came over in the morning. I had told Patrice she was coming for brunch. Kevin had been invited, which he didn't know I knew, because Patrice had texted him the night before. He showed up at 11. He walked in with a bag from the bakery, smiled, shook my hand. I shook it back. I did not squeeze any harder than necessary. We all sat down at the dining room table, and then I looked at Kevin, and I looked at my wife, and I said very calmly, "I think we should talk about some things." What happened in the next 2 hours was uncomfortable and painful, and I will not dramatize it. There were denials that collapsed under documentation. There was crying. There was a moment where Kevin stood up like he was going to leave, and Elaine said, very quietly, "Sit down, Kevin," and something in her voice made him sit. The denials gave way to a kind of stunned silence when I laid out what I had, what my attorney had, and what the financial advisor had already helped me arrange. Kevin left that house understanding that whatever he thought he'd been setting up had not worked out the way he'd planned. Patrice and I separated formally 6 weeks later. The divorce process was not fast, and it was not easy, and it cost more money than I want to think about. But because I had prepared, because I had not reacted in that first moment of shock, because I had taken those weeks to think and plan and talk to the right people, I came out of it with the house, with my pension intact, with the retirement accounts properly divided, with my dignity. Elaine filed for divorce from Kevin on the same day I filed from Patrice. Those proceedings are still ongoing. She is doing better than she was. She got a dog. She started running again. On Sunday mornings, she calls me while I have my coffee, and we talk about nothing in particular. The weather, the tomatoes she planted, her Dobbs vet appointments. It's one of my favorite parts of the week. I want to say one thing before I finish, because I think it's the thing that actually matters. I hear from people sometimes, neighbors, old colleagues, men my age, who find out I went through this and they ask how I handled it. How I didn't just blow it all up the moment I saw what I saw. And I tell them the same thing every time. There's a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is what the pain wants you to do. Yell, confront, make the other person feel what you feel right now in this moment. Responding is what your future self needs you to do. I was in shock in that parking lot. I was humiliated. I was furious in a way I hadn't been furious since I was a much younger man. But I gave myself one night to feel all of it completely. And then the next morning, I started making decisions instead of scenes. The house is quiet now. I have dinner with Elaine on Thursdays. My knee is about the same. I found that woodworking book, and I'm 3 chapters in, and I think I might actually build something this summer. The hardest thing I ever did was walk back through that garage and sit at my own dinner table and act like nothing had changed. But that walk bought me everything that came after, and I am not, and I was never, the victim of this story. I was the one holding the blueprint. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any grand cosmic sense, just in the plain, practical way that a 64-year-old man thinks when he's sitting alone in a quiet house with a cup of coffee and know where he has to be. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices people make don't disappear. They accumulate. Quietly, invisibly, like water finding its way through a crack in a foundation. You don't see the damage until one day. The whole thing shifts and you realize the crack was there for years. Patrice made choices. Kevin made choices. And for a long time I made the choice not to see what was in front of me. Not because I was stupid, but because I trusted people I had every reason to trust. That trust wasn't a weakness. I want to be clear about that. Trusting the people you've built your life with is not a character flaw. What happened to me was not a failure of my judgment. It was a failure of their character. And there is a difference worth holding on to. The hardest thing I've had to learn, and I'm still learning it at 64, is that wisdom isn't knowing everything in advance. Wisdom is what you do in the aftermath. It's the decision you make in a parking lot when everything in you wants to go back in that house and yell until your throat gives out. It's choosing the harder, slower, quieter road because you understand that your future deserves more than your pain does right now. I think about Elaine a lot, about the fact that she had been carrying her own version of this for almost a year. She was protecting me and protecting herself at the same time. And she was doing it alone. And she never once came apart at the seams. Not until she had someone to come apart with. That kind of strength doesn't come from nowhere. It's built, slowly, by 1,000 small decisions to keep going even when keeping going is hard. I'd like to think I had something to do with that. I'd also like to think she taught me something that Friday morning at her kitchen table. that asking for help is not surrender. It's strategy. The people who wronged me will have to live with what they did. That's not something I decided. It's just how things work. The gap between who you present yourself to be and who you actually are has a way of closing eventually. And when it does, there's nowhere to stand. Kevin walked into my house with a bakery bag and a firm handshake and thought he had the whole thing figured out. He didn't account for the fact that the man he underestimated had spent 30 years reading blueprints for a living, finding the flaw in the structure that everyone else walked right past. I'm not angry anymore. That surprised me, honestly. I thought the anger would be the last thing to go, but what replaced it wasn't indifference. It was something closer to clarity. I know who I am, I know what I built, I know what I protected, and I know that my daughter calls me on Sunday mornings and we talk about tomatoes and dogs and nothing in particular, and that is worth more than anything Kevin thought he was going to take. Build something that lasts. Be honest, even when it costs you. And when someone shows you who they are, really shows you, believe them the first time. The second time is always more expensive.